It comes up fairly often that someone wants to make a recording with the Octatrack that is longer than 64 steps. It's pretty easy to do this, but a brand new project isn't set up properly for it. I'm going to use my track Essence of the Machine for my demonstration project and record the intro arrangement. This project is already using Record Buffer 8 as a master track oscilloscope, and some other channels are set up for continuous resampling, but any of the buffers that aren't being used will work just fine. The Octatrack can do up to 8 simultaneous recordings. The first thing to do is to go into the Project menu, into the Control submenu, and then into Memory. A default project has dynamic recorders set to No, and we definitely want it to be Yes, so that we can exceed the reserved length for our buffer and access as much of the RAM as possible. The dotted area of the bar on the right represents flex memory that's being used by loaded samples. The solid black bar is space reserved for the recorder buffers, and the white space in the middle is what we have available for recording. So with Function and the first record button, I'm going to go into the recording setup menu for track 1. The bottom right corner in both seconds and sequencer steps shows how long of a recording we can make with this particular buffer. I only need a few minutes to record the intro of this track, but if you want to make the longest recording possible, don't load any files to the flex slots and don't reserve any memory for other record buffers. I set the source 3 record to track 8 since it's my master track. When directly accessing a track for resampling, you're getting the pre-fader level, which in this project is a problem, as that's actually clipping. When making long recordings like this, the waveform display of the Octatrack struggles a little bit, so I'm going to set this to sample from the main outputs rather than directly from track 8, because I want the post-fader level. So before I hit the play button on the sequencer, I need to manually trigger the internal source 3 recording. So now I should be getting a recording that's not clipping, or at least not clipping as badly. If we don't want to manually start the recording, we have a few different options. By activating grid record mode in the recording setup menu, we can now place record trigs in the sequencer to automate recording. Hold down the record trig to see the recording sources that are activated for that recording trig. I'll disable both audio input pairs for this recording trig. You could also disable the inputs in the recording setup menu itself and record various combinations and mixes of the different inputs. So now I just need to start the sequencer and delete my record trig. It will now record until either it runs out of memory or I stop the sequencer. We can also use a type of trigger that we don't have to delete immediately, called a one-shot trigger. To turn a trigger into a one-shot trigger, you hold Function and press the trigger. It will turn yellow. Unfortunately, in this footage, it's a bit difficult to distinguish between the yellow LEDs and the red LEDs. After the one-shot trigger is activated, it becomes disarmed and alternates between red and yellow. Generally, I avoid using one-shot triggers, as I have a tendency to accidentally arm them. The most straightforward way to rearm a one-shot trig is to simply press it once. However, there are a variety of ways to arm and disarm one-shot triggers, and the sample one-shot triggers are separate from the recording one-shot triggers. A detailed examination of one-shot triggers is outside the scope of this video, so we'll move on to how we can manually stop the recording before the memory is full. So back into the first recording setup menu, I'm going to change the trig behavior from 1 to 1, 2. This will allow me to manually determine the end of the recording. So I'll manually start the recording and start the sequencer and take a look at the record menu. You can see we're happily recording. Now I'm going to exit the record menu and stop the recording. Now we'll take a look at our finished recording. Oops, need to be in the record setup menu for that shortcut to work properly. Nothing exciting, but we verified that we have stopped a long recording at our arbitrary point in time. So now I'm going to use my caveman method of simply removing the record trig to record the entire intro until the memory is full. I'll skip to the end of this recording. We don't need to listen to 3 minutes of this track. There we go, record memory full. Now that we have a nice long recording, let's take a listen back to it. If I play back this file through any of my existing tracks, it's going to be transformed by the effects, so I'm going to go to a completely new bank and create a new part in order to listen to this recording. I'm going to go into the recording setup menu and save the recording that I made. Properly naming samples is always a bit of a challenge, but I don't have to think too hard for this one. Saving longer samples like this to the card takes a moment, so I didn't speed up this footage in order to show how long it takes in real time. I'll take this opportunity to mention that you can also start and stop recording using an external MIDI controller or sequencer, or by using MIDI loopback. But for most cases, that approach is needlessly complicated. Check out the card that just popped up for my demonstration using MIDI loopback to trigger sampling, which is particularly useful for generative and probabilistic approaches. Okay, finally. Now we have to decide where we want to assign the sample. I'm just going to assign it to the first free static slot, which is static slot number 1. So now to play it back with as little transformation as possible, I'm just going to trigger it manually by exiting grid record mode. The playback gain of this is being modified somewhat. We have to consider the track level, the track that the sample is playing through, the master track level that the track is also playing through, and the sample attributes gain as well. Just taking a look at the waveform a bit here. As you can see, it's a bit inconvenient to navigate around with the Octatrack audio editor when dealing with such a long sample. Zooming in on the peaks a bit here, we can see that this recording did not actually clip, but you can see from the squared off edges that obviously the master track compressor was being clipped internally, and there was likely some other internal clipping going on with the individual tracks as well. Since I'm using a master track, it's important to go take a look at that. I'm going to turn up its level. And also the default filter on the master track should be removed for increased transparency of playback. The delay can stay. I'm not aware of it affecting the audio in any way when not activated. The other main effect besides the filter to avoid when wanting maximum audio transparency is the DJ EQ. It's rare for me to play back long samples from the Octatrack, so once I had this long sample recorded, it was pretty fun to do some processing on it. I'm curious how far I can transform it from the original source material while still maintaining some semblance of useful musicality. When I added this neighbor track, I forgot that I had the sequencer stopped, which meant I needed to trigger the neighbor track before I begin to hear its effects. With the sequencer running, it would have been automatically triggered. It took me a while to figure out that one. Using filters in series like this with different processing stages in between them can yield a lot of interesting transformations. As the processing chain grows longer, changes in earlier stages of the processing have more and more dramatic effects. Using multiple filters allows for greater control over the frequency ranges emphasized or ignored. I learned my mistake from the first neighbor machine, and I trigged this one immediately. I just want to smear this as much as possible, so time to add a reverb. Clearly, my memory is pretty short because I forgot to trigger this third neighbor machine for quite a while. Let's skip ahead a bit to where that happens. At this point, I had turned down the gain significantly at various points in the signal chain. This was to help avoid clipping artifacts being caused by effects overloaded at their inputs or outputs. The dark reverb and the spring reverb are both very sensitive to input gain.